topic of my talk today is really to what Trabecular bone scores. It's really for pride time in clinical practice. So my very first question to you guys is, can you easily stand on one leg? Well, most of you may say, yes, I've been trying yoga lesson and I can, but not that long. It's not that comfortable. And clearly be on two legs is much better. And actually, that's kind of normal because when we talk about osteoporosis, the definition rely mostly on two different pillars. It's a systematic disease that will be characterized by low bone mass and microarchitecture of the bone, microarchitecture deterioration of the bone, leading to an unacceptable risk of fracture or the risk of the fracture itself. So while we know there is two pillars or two legs to the definition, actually in reality, in clinical practice, we're mostly using the bone mineral density as the gold standard, and we use the WHO definition with a T-score definition, be either normal, osteopenic, or osteoporotic. And if we look at the slides below, just turn that, sorry, just to make it smaller. If we use the slides, you all know this graph that's been presented by Sierres et al. For almost like for 16 years, but still very much valid. Where we decrease the density, we can see an increase of the risk of fracture. Till there, it's fine. However, where we're counting the number of fracture, we have about 40 to 50% of the fracture that occurring in a non-osteoporotic zone. Having said that, it's kind of a normal because we can have exactly the same BMD, but the underlying structure can be quite different. Same BMD, underlying structure could be different. That's why we have the two pillars in the definition of osteoporosis. We have the two legs. Actually, it's a bit more complex than just two legs because we should almost talk about bone strengths, which have been redefined by NIH like this. And the bone strength is a mix of bone quantity and bone quality. And where we have about quality is not only bone microstructure, it's also bone turnover, bone mineralization, and bone geometry of the bone, the microstructure of the bone. But we'll focus mostly at the bone microstructure, which is one of the most important part of the bone quality. So that's where we go to TBS. So TBS stands for Trabecular bone score. It's been FDA approved already in 2012, and then further approved by adding all the features like a FRAX adjusted by TBS in 2015. So it's a software that installed on the workstation or directly on the DEXA machine that can estimate the bone structure information from a regular PA spine DEXA scan. It's also been shown to be strongly correlated to bone microarchitecture, either from micro-CT studies or from bone histomorphometry study. And it provides information on fracture risk, which is additive to BMD and additive to clinical risk factors. But we'll come back in a second. So the principle is you can have, as I said before, the very same density or almost the same identical density from two different patients, but the underlying structure could be either good structure or poor structure, and that will lead to completely different level. And the TBS is a good structure, will be high TBS value. If it's a poor structure, it will be low TBS value. So obviously, if you have the same patient, two different patients with the same density, but different underlying structure, the way you will manage the patient have to be different, as we know from the WHO definition of osteoporosis. So practically, you have the software installed on the DEXA scans, and then when you have done the DEXA analysis within few seconds, then you will be able to have a TBS report that come here with a reference curve, the image, and the individual value of the TBS and the combined value. So because it's easy to use and you can retrospectively analyze the past, there is already more than 2,500 systems installed worldwide. So a lot of Europe, because that's where it started, but also a lot of in Japan, a lot of Asia, and also a lot in United States, where there is close to 500 licenses in the United States only. So having said that, because of retrospective capacity, there is a huge amount of literature. There is more than 600 publications and more than 20 international national guidelines. So out of these, all medical society, what come out? It just said that TBS is a new predictor of fracture, which is independent of BMD, clinical risk factors, and FRAX. it helps with fine-tuning assessment of fracture rate, mostly in the gray zone, both in men and women. When we talk about gray zone, we talk about osteopenic patient or secondary osteoporosis patient in diabetic glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis or CKD patient, HIV, and so on. And also in osteoarthritic patient, in the same that we know that it will forcefully evaluate, the osteoarthritis will forcefully increase the BMD, sorry, while it's almost not impacting the TBS. And also will impact every patient that will be close to the interventional threshold. Interestingly, there is different treatment impact TBS differently, but we'll come back on that. So practically, if I'm focusing on the fracture prediction, can we do better as we do right now with the BMD and clinical risk factor? The answer is, well, most likely yes. Here, this is the first study we published with Bill Leslie in 2011 based on the Manitoba cohort. It's so far the largest prospective study on osteoporosis ever, with more than 33,000 women here follow up to 5 years and even more now. And what we have seen here is when you combine the classical definition of osteoporosis, meaning the minimum T-score level from all sides, spine or hip, what we see here is combined with the TBS. Lowest tertile will be converted to a low TBS value, meaning poor structure. So first of all, if you have a normal BMD and a normal structure, the level of risk of having a fracture is extremely low. Now, if you have reversely here, osteoporosis and low TBS, you have an extremely high level of risk of having a fracture, which could be like a very high risk or imminent fracture risk that could be just trigger certain type of management. But more interestingly is, you remember the overlap between fracture and non-fracture in the osteopenic zone? What we have here, if you have an osteopenic patient with a low TBS, the level of risk is pretty much similar to what you see in the osteoporotic zone. And that's where we mostly miss the scans. And we can see here, if we just display the number of fracture, major fracture, 54% of them were within the osteoporotic category, 39 in osteopenic, and 7 in healthy. And out of 39, 43% of them were having a low TBS, which represent like 16% of the total number of fractures. So in other words, if you combine the BMD as we used to do in clinical practice, this is adjusted for clinical risk factors and TBS, then you can recapture about 16% of the fracture, where you improve the accuracy from 54% to 70% in terms of identification of patient at risk of fracture. So when we talk about BMD and TBS, always people come to FRAX. Of course, we have a FRAX combining clinical risk factors and BMD. Whether or not TBS can add to that, it was a big question a couple of years ago. And actually, the answer is also yes. You can see a similar pattern to what we've seen with BMD, in the sense that if you have a high probability of risk of fracture by the FRAX, but you also use the tertile of TBS, if you have a high probability of fracture plus low TBS, your probability will be even higher or even lower if you have a normal BMD. So because of that, the FRAX group decided just to study and incorporate a meta-analysis and Manitoba data into like the FRAX model and so on to take the TBS into account in the FRAX. So here this is based on a patient from the United States, 65, she's a woman with mostly no factor, clinical risk factor. She got a glucocorticoid and she had a T-score of -2. And you see the probability of fracture is 16 and about 3 for hip fracture. So you can see underneath, there is an adjust for TBS. And when you press that one, you will have a pop-up screen that will come. Then if you enter the TBS value, assuming that this one would be low, for example, on this case, and what we'll have here, we'll have a patient that moved from 16 to 21%, which is for United States above the intervention threshold, or most of the time above the age-dependent. So some people start to say, yeah, but if I apply that to my whole population, you know what, there is not much change. Well, obviously, yes, because if you have here an age-dependent threshold and you have a patient which is a very low risk, the TBS will not change and revolutionize completely the diagnostic. So in average, if you consider all subjects, you have between 2 to 5% of the patients that will really be impacted. However, if you get close to the intervention threshold, around 20% or along the age-dependent threshold, then you can see it come more close to 25%, meaning from 1 patient out of 5 or 1 patient out of 4 will be impacted by the TBS value by either bringing it back to a higher risk zone or lower risk zone. So the bottom line is the most added value of TBS regarding FRAX. That will be with this yellow zone, orange zone. Every time you have a patient here, the TBS might change the category, either to consider for treatment or not treatment. So, but FRAX is very useful and a lot of people use that around the world, but still a lot of countries don't use FRAX. Still, insurance don't reimburse DXA or don't even consider treatment on the basis of FRAX, still using the context of BMD T-score. And if I'm taking, not to offend anybody, if I'm taking the Swiss one, then we see that a lot of decision about the bisphosphonate or raloxifene, denosumab, deriparatide, and so on, still a lot of them will consider the T-score as the threshold to treat or not to treat. And that's very important. Because of that, well, what we develop here also will be Leslie, John Canis, and some others. The adjustment factor we did for FRAX by adjusting FRAX back TBS, we did the same for the BMD T-score, where we just adjusting the BMD T-score of spine or hip by the value, the added value of TBS. And that's been published in the Osteoporosis International, and that allows us, if you don't use FRAX, to take the TBS into account through the BMD T-score value. I will show you how we can interpret that. So as a secondary osteoporosis, so I won't have much time just to go through that. It's just been demonstrated in type 2 diabetes, in GIO patient, primary hyperparathyroidism, HIV, CKD patient, and many others, that TBS is almost more impacted in secondary osteoporosis than it is than BMD itself. Type 2 diabetes is a good example. In type 2 diabetes, it tends to be supernormal BMD, while we know the level of risk increase and the number of fracture increase in type 2 diabetic patients. In those patients, the TBS is degraded. But furthermore, it's interesting to see that it's degraded only if the glycemic level is not controlled. So if you have an uncontrolled glycemic level, then the structure will be low. If you control your glycemic level, then the TBS tend to be normal. And that's quite interesting, because then when we have patient which is not in a pre-diabetic stage or not been diagnosed, it could be a sign that something's happening. And again, we'll come back in a second on that. So TBS and monitoring, can it help? Actually, there is a lot of debate about TBS and monitoring for quite a while. And actually it depends the way we see things. So it depends if you see the glass half full or half empty. Because usually the response varies on the type of molecule. Usually less responsive in amplitude than the BMD. So a lot of people say, well, in BMD, I've been getting 3 or 4% this year, and be only 0.5% or 1% for TBS. Yeah, it's not good. But the fact that it varies upon the type of molecule makes things quite interesting. And we'll come back on that, because if we just look at the different type of molecule we have at hand right now, with, I should even add now romosozumab, what we should have here is, depending on the mechanism of action, the impact on the density or the structure of the bone could be quite different. Obviously that in bone anabolic bone will have more impact on the density and the structure. In denosumab, we have remodeling transient plus, we have a strong impact on BMD, but have some impact on microstructure because we have less degradation to some extent. On biphosphonate, we're supposed to have a good impact on BMD, but we're supposed to maintain the structure, not really improve the structure, so to speak. So that I will call positive maintenance, while in the HRTs, we'll have like more negative maintenance in a sense that will slow down the loss as compared to a normal menopausal woman. And of course, if we have aromatase inhibitor or glucocorticoid and so on, that will be strong impact, negative impact on the structure. So the bottom line, based on the different type of molecule, we will expect different impact on BMD and TBS. And for the different studies, if we line them up here on one slide, a summary of different studies, and then we have like a systematic review and meta-analysis on treatment that will be published pretty soon. But what we can see here is that clearly the anabolic will improve both BMD and TBS. Denosumab improved BMD quite a lot, and to some extent also TBS, that can even be further fine if we just having a long-lasting period. The biphosphonate is barely above, but that means just maintaining the structure, which is not bad. And then you have an MHT that has been slow, the last structure as compared to placebo and the others. So different profile can lead to different decision, and then we'll come back also in the future. So if I take all these different aspects of secondary osteoporosis, fracture protection, impact, the different treatment and so on, let's put that in a practice, and I will share with you what we use in our current center in Lausanne. So I will be a bit provocative, but have a logical approach. So if you see that logo here, it means that it's based on our clinical experience rather than official guidelines. Okay, just to be clear. So when we have to position TBS, we have kind of a brainstorming, and then we say, okay, as with BMD, we have to have a quality check, because you know we have the garbage in, garbage out. It works for BMD, but also for TBS. Then we talk about bone health diagnosis, could be a structure or bone health status combining both. And then we have all the treatment phase, will be like, should I treat or not? How should I treat? How long should I treat? So we put all this in different elements, and then we come with 6 steps on how to use TBS. First one is check image quality. As we said before, garbage in, garbage out. So we have to ensure that the edge detection is the same, that there is no presence of vertebral fracture or metallic artifact, that the BMI is within working range, and so on. So that's quite important. Then we characterize the bone structure as we do with BMD, where we have normal, osteopenic, osteoporotic. So we'll do like a normal structure, partially degraded or degraded, according to this threshold that have been defined from the meta-analysis published by McCluskey a couple of years ago. And then we have this reference curve. But then it's not important if you just use that alone. It's not meant to be used alone. It's meant to be used in conjunction with BMD. So what I showed you before from the Manitoba, we surely use that into practice by saying, okay, let's see the level, the profile of risk for my patient by combining the minimum T-score from spine and hip, meaning spine, total hip, and femoral neck, and the TBS. So if we have, for example, here a patient which is osteopenic with a degraded TBS, then for me, just ring a bell. We should first ask ourselves, is it normal for the age of the patient? Do we have a known secondary osteoporosis? Do we have undiagnosed vertebral fracture, already prevalent major fracture, or a known pre-diabetic or diabetic? If we have any doubts, then in our case, that will trigger potentially additional exams in terms of X-rays or diabetic tests or some other biomarkers, some other thing, depending on the profile of the patient, because we interpret that in the context of the clinical context of the patient side. So then the next question is, should I treat? So there is 2 options. Either the option 1 will be to use a FRAX adjusted by TBS. So we provide here a table where we have a FRAX risk and a FRAX risk adjusted by TBS. And then we'll link to the IOF algorithm to choose the type of treatment. Say, okay, we have a low risk, high risk, very high risk, because then we'll see whether or not the risk adjusted by TBS go above or below the intervention threshold to decide about the type of to decide to treat or not to treat. The second option is the one I mentioned before. We have the BMD T-score. Now we can have the BMD T-score, which take into account the TBS, the structure of the bone. We'll call that BMD T-score adjusted by TBS. So that means we can consider that if I have an osteopenic patient, for example, with a low TBS, which is the case here, then we may end up by having a BMD T-score adjusted, which is equivalent to osteoporosis like. And that will trigger for me like, okay, if we take the TBS into account while my patient was osteopenic, it become like osteoporotic like, and that will allow us to treat. So in the case of the Shelley Center, so we have like a structured report where we have the data about the indication, we have like the BMD here, then we have like a VFA outcome, we have the TBS, we'll have like a reference curve and so on. And then at the end, that was like the full table that we have, like the risk assessment, the BMD T-score here, the FRAX here, and there is Swiss international Swiss FRAX interventions ratio. So we use both approach in our report where we'll combine the BMD T-score adjusted by TBS and the FRAX adjusted by TBS, and we make a decision on that basis. But we have to be careful. Why that? Because FRAX or even BMD T-score adjusted or not, doesn't really matter. We'll tell you who to treat, but not how to treat. And that's important because if I come back to the truth here, which one it is, both angles have a different view of the truth and both are right. And that's the same with FRAX. You can have the FRAX value can be defined. You can have like, oh, my patient had the FRAX of 25%. But you know what, that 25%, what does it mean? That means you have a high risk. How are we going to use that to treat my patient? Oh, I will treat it. Good. But if it's based on clinical risk factors only, meaning that, oh, I'm 85 years old, and you know, my mom had a hip fracture in the past, that means, and maybe I had like a smoking or whatever. Okay, good. Can you reverse the age? No. Can you reverse the hip fracture of your mother from the old days? No. Can you reverse the smoking? Yeah, potentially you can stop smoking. But then that means the risk related to that one will not be identified or reversible by the treatment, so to speak. Now, if you have, so it'd be mostly lifestyle. Although you can combine that because the previous fracture, for example, you still have a residual risk, and then giving a good treatment can reduce the future risk of fracture, but may not impact much of the bone, but mostly the overall risk. Now it can be bone related, and if it's quality or quantity, then you have a slightly different profile. So if I put that in the context of the half full and half empty, and the fact that you have a different type of molecule will impact differently the BMD and the TBS, then you can use that to your advantage. In a sense here, that you have like a different profile, and from that different profile, you can give, well, I have a like osteopenic patient or whatever, but the structure is very low. Okay, can I give a biphosphonate? Yes, you can give a biphosphonate for 1 year to smooth maybe the potential rebounds effect down the road. But the biphosphonate will not improve the macrostructure of the bone in most of the patients, maybe in some of them, but not majority of them. In that case, you will not reduce the risk significantly. In that case, we will go more towards a denosumab. Now, if you have here an osteopenic patient, which have a good structure, well, if you want to give a biphosphonate and improve the density and maintain the structure of the bone, well, you can give biphosphonate, it's fine. You can even give a MHT depending on the age of the patient, and even if you decrease a bit the structure, you have a normal structure which is high enough just to allow yourself to lose a bit of structure down the road and reassess down the road. So that's the idea. And for us, for example, if we have an osteopenic patient, which is either osteoporotic by BMD T-score adjusted or above the FRAX intervention, then we'll treat, and then we'll choose the type of treatment according to the profile, risk profile of a given patient, and choose a molecule accordingly. So treat to lower reason. So it's a big question and a lot of debate about that for years. How long should we treat the patient? So some people say, oh, 2 years, 3 years, just coming out with numbers. But at the end is what we want. And some people say, oh, let's try to treat the patient with the BMD of the hip above minus 2.5. Yeah, but sometimes you will treat the patient will be like a -2 or -1.5 at the hip, while the spine will be -3 or -4. So that means the target will be the hip, while it's already osteopenic, you get a problem. So the idea here is just to bring your patient to a lower risk zone as defined by a mix again of density and structure. So you can choose, for example, if you have a patient which is here, which is like a high risk or very high risk, and the patient say, I don't want to take any anabolic, I don't want to take denosumab, for example, I really want my biphosphonate. Okay, fine. But then you will have to treat your patient much longer in time just to reach a level of almost normal, because you have a degraded structure with a normal, your level of risk will still be there. So you will reduce the risk, and every time you change the risk zone, you have to reassess. Obviously, if you're here, the fastest will be to go that way. That means either with anabolic drug or denosumab, just to speed up the exit of the very high risk zone. So when you get off the high risk zone, doesn't mean you stop the treatment. That means you reconsider, because, for example, if you had in the past a previous fracture, the residual risk is still there, and you should treat for a longer period of time. Maybe you will decide to go with a moderate drug, or maybe a prophylaxis, or like a lifestyle, and then maybe drug holiday for a while and reassess after to reinitiate a treatment if the patient go back to a much higher risk zone. So that will be up to you to decide in a clinical context. So that's again what we have in our site, where we have a BMD and a TBS follow-up. And then we have this kind of a graph here will tell us which direction, whether the trend is go towards a high risk zone, a low risk zone, and so on. And that's the way also we decide to maintain, change, or switch different drugs. So the bottom line, I will conclude with these two last slides. The idea is not to treat more, is to treat better those who are really in need. And the bottom line is you always have to take into account the clinical context of your patient and trust your own judgment, because sometimes guidelines mean to help to make a decision. It doesn't mean to make the decision for you. At the end, you are facing your patient and you have to make the decision. So whether or not really for prime time in clinical use for TBS, the answer is clearly yes, because now it just fulfills, it's a second leg to your patients, so that he can stand on the two legs just to make it more comfortable. So we're in a very difficult period. So in March 2020, the entire world was shut down, but aging continued. So don't forget to take care of osteoporosis, because when you get the fracture, you get it for life. You cannot revert that process, and then the quality of life will just be suffering, and the comorbidity and so on will be a cascade event and so on. So having said that, thank you very much. And I will turn over to Dr. Shelley, that will go more into the TBS products, so to speak. So Shelley, I stop talking, and that's your turn.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Hans. Really great information, and really kind of sets the stage for what I wanted to present here, which basically is why we have designed TBS the way we have, is to really to make the decision making so we can identify more patients at risk, fine-tune the therapy decisions, and improve the patient management. And those are the things that have been discussed just now by Professor Hans. And so our most recent version of TBS, version 3.1 all-in-one, is to really kind of hone in on that I-FI idea. So a lot of this is overview. Thank you for going forward. Actually, you can continue to go forward, because some of it is a summary of what Professor Hans already has done. So, you know, we're basically the gold standard for microarchitecture, and it's really designed to be seamless and in your routine clinical practice. I won't go on this because Professor Hans actually went through a lot of this already. So we'll go to the next slide. I wanted to give you guys some background about the new version of the software, because it's designed so that you can actually do this, this thought process better than what we've had in the past. As Professor Hans went through, is that, you know, TBS is important in conjunction with bone density. So it can be used standalone, but it's the combination with the bone density that's the most important of it, which then by combining TBS with bone density, we fulfill the the World Health Organization osteoporosis definition of density and structure. Next slide. And I think our slides have slowed down.
It's there.
It's there. I'm just not seeing it.
So that's the one with the Eiffel Tower.
Okay, thank you. So when the Eiffel Tower comes up, what you'll see is it kind of goes to the discussion that Professor Hans was saying. I cannot do the Spock thing in looking at the different structures. But if you look at the Eiffel Tower, and this just really kind of hones in of why it's so important, is that you can see that you've got a wood-made Eiffel Tower with the same structure as the one made of metal. Well, those are two different densities. So that makes sense that the one made out of wood is going to be less stable. But if we have Eiffel Tower made of metal, of the exact same amount of metal, the same density, but the structure has been changed, you can see the one on the right is now more prone to collapse because we've gotten rid of the scaffolding, which is really important to the structure. And hence, that's why it's the BMD and TBS combined. Next slide.
It is.
And this just sort of highlights what Professor Hans was saying in the sense of secondary osteoporosis. I had them all labeled here and the different ones to be able to refer to again later, but these are the areas that we have the biggest impact in combining BMD and TBS. Next slide.
It is.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the slide's just a little slow in changing. So how does it work in your daily routine? A couple of things that I wanted to highlight when you're using TBS. There are certain elements that you need to make sure that are in process. The good thing is you don't have to do another scan. It actually is analyzed based on the bone density exam that you already have. So it's integrated completely into your workflow, which is actually really, really important. So no additional radiation, no additional time for the patient. And the analysis itself takes about 3 seconds for it to occur, which is great. For the hologic devices, it is now available. The version 3.1, the one that I'm going to go over with the report, it's on your Apex software 4.1 and higher now. So it's available for quite a large number. So I want to provide that for you guys so that when you're looking at whether or not you have software that's compatible, you know where it goes back and which ones they are. TBS is only done on the lumbar spine, but there's correlation that shows that the TBS as a predictor of fracture also as a predictor of fracture for both hip and forearms as well. It's only available for patients over 20 years of age. That's what we have the claims for. There's a lot of studies that are being done in children, and that may be something coming down the pike in a little bit later, but it's currently only for adults. And of course, we still have a little bit of issue about the BMI. So you see the BMI range there that you have. So you have a patient who's very, very obese. It would have difficulty in giving the good information. And of course, no express mode. So it has to be in an array. Next slide.
Okay. And you see it? It looks like being very slow on some computer too. So
that's okay. It's gone to the next slide. So this is good. Here's the benefit of the 3.1 is it really takes the concept of everything that Professor Hans presented and puts it into one report and one form. So it truly actually is the first report that has both TBS and BMD on one report combined. It takes the bone density scan, it takes the TBS scan, and it takes the FRAX tool and puts it all into one report. So it's going to save a lot of extra time that you would have to do all these different reports, and it's combined into one, which is really great. And next slide, please. And what you'll see is we've actually combined the grid that Professor Hans discussed, which is the BMD T-score at the top and the TBS degradation level to the left. So as you see the report on the left-hand side, it gives you the TBS spine mapping, it gives you the spine results in the sense of the reference curve, but it gives you a couple of really important features that weren't there before. One is the fracture risk assessment grid, which goes into the whole discussion Professor Hans described in taking BMD T-score and TBS together in making decisions. Secondly, you have some therapeutic decision tools. So we've combined the FRAX pieces there, both adjusted and not adjusted. So you have both pieces of information. And it also has the BMD T-score adjusted. And so therefore, if your decision making about therapy is either requires a T-score, it's going to give you the TBS adjusted T-score to help you make more valid decisions about treatment threshold. Another really good thing about the report is that on the second page, what you'll see there is it has automatic conclusions. You can go ahead to the next one, please. I've kind of summarized most of these already.
So which one?
That one's fine right there.
Oh, this one.
Yep, keep going. One more. That's great. Thank you.
Where?
You're perfect. Just let it be.
Trending report?
Well, we're okay. We're getting close to questions and answers. So basically, it also gives you automatic conclusions, which really helps to interpretation of TBS. It takes into consideration BMD, it takes into consideration TBS, it takes into consideration the T-score adjusted, not adjusted, or FRAX, and gives you an automatic conclusion that can be modified if you want, but it saves a lot of time in interpretation. And finally, we have a trending report. So as you're following up with these patients, whether they're being treated or not treated, you're going to have a follow-up report that will show you how they're trending. Have we moved from a high-risk zone to a medium risk zone? Or are we going even further into a higher risk? It'll tell you that on the fracture risk zone trend, and it'll also show you on the spine trend zone. And then it gives you the conclusions of what to make from the trending. So it's a really nice report because it really gives you everything that you need into one area, and that's why it's the all-in-one. And finally, we have a report on the next slide, please, explains what each one of the sections of the report, how they work. And it basically gives a one-page explanation of all the things we just went through. So we have this available for you to really kind of help out as you're going through with the report. But it's really designed to be quite seamless and quite effective and helpful. But I noticed that we actually have a question, and that was one that came right after Professor Hans finished his speech. So what I'd like to do now is take that moment that I've kind of gave you sort of how the report helps out in really trying to address and come up with the answers and questions associated with what Professor Hans has presented. So why don't we go ahead and take a couple of Q&As now from the group. I'm going to open up the first one. Professor Hans, can you see it as well? Yeah. This might be a really good one for you to answer.
Quite a good question about it. Given that you cannot perform BMD on everyone, which patients should get TBS? Only those who are osteopenic, those who are osteopenic but have FRAX. Patient, do you apply the same age criteria for the same? What about diabetic, which you mentioned? Can you have a normal BMD per poor quality? Okay, it's like a multiple question into one. So when you say you cannot perform BMD on everyone, well, anyway, you need the BMD to be done in order to have TBS. You cannot perform TBS without having a BMD. Now, sometimes you cannot interpret the BMD because there's too much arthrosis on the spine. In that case, you will have to drop the spine. But in that case, you may drop the spine BMD, but then the TBS at the spine, which is mostly not impacted by osteoarthritis, will be still useful. So given the fact that it doesn't add much in terms of time, no radiation, you don't need to re-radiate the patient and so on. Then having TBS, we do, at least in the field, we do that on all our patients. Now, do you apply the same edge criteria you use for FRAX? Yes, actually on FRAX, we won't have FRAX for 20 years old or 30 years old. So the correction, I think as far as I remember, FRAX start at the age of 45, more or less. So we'll provide adjustment starting 45 and above. And now you have another question, what about diabetic? Indeed, sometimes we have a normal BMD and we can have a normal BMD. And if you're a pre-diabetic state, for example, and you don't know yet, and then the glycemic level are not been controlled, meaning above 7.5, in that case, you will most likely have the TBS that will be lower, demonstrating that a higher level of risk, while the BMD would have been normal. So the answer is yes again for that. You can have a normal BMD and poor bone quality, as we've been demonstrated in many studies now.
And Professor Hans, can't you have that same situation in other secondary osteoporosis?
Yeah, there is plenty of situation that it could be like a normal density or partially degraded density, and whereas the TBS is much lower. For example, ankylosing spondylitis for rheumatoid disease, for example, you have a bamboo spine or AS, for example, the BMD will be just go to the sky, so extremely high. And in those patients, we tend to have a TBS that is also very low. And that's quite interesting because if you see, for example, the reference curve, most of the time, if you measure like 1,000 patients, you will see that from the spine BMD, we tend to have the spine BMD tend to go up again after the age of 65 because of the residual arthritis and so on. So in the reality, why is the TBS still declining, demonstrating again that you're mostly not impacted by that. But there is plenty of CKD patient. You have like degradation of both BMD, but even more with TBS. If you take patient in with breast cancer with anti-aromatase treatment, then the BMD will be impacted, but TBS will be highly degraded because of the therapy. So we have to be careful about the type of therapy that will be given and potentially act on the bone afterwards just to make it up the loss of bone. So we heal something, but we sometimes damage the other part. That's also the same with a GIO patient. When you have a high dose of cortisone, the cortisone may impact the density, but even more the TBS, the structure will be highly degraded, and that's where you have the added value. So in most of the case, if you have a normal condition, the BMD and the TBS will run in parallel, meaning that not much added value. But when you start to have secondary osteoporosis or other conditions, that's where you have a divergence between the BMD and the TBS. That's where you have more added value. Let me give you an example, for example, on a patient that we have followed for a couple of years. And that patient came to us and he was having an osteopenic BMD. So till there, it's fine. And then we have like a check 2 years after. And during that period of time, the patient lost about 7–8%. So he was still osteopenic, but with a major decline in a BMD for quite a while. So it was decided that we put that patient on a biphosphonate. So we put that patient on biphosphonate, and 2 years after, we have like a nice rebound, and he gained about like a 7–8%. So we continue 1 more year, and then it was like almost 10% increase. So it was good. But then the patient had a vertebral fracture. So we were very embarrassed about that one. So what we did, at that time, we didn't have the TBS, but we were able to, at the early days, but with the last data point, we had TBS. So we retrospectively analyzed the past. And what's happened with that patient is when the first patient, the first visit, it was like osteopenic, like partially degraded. At the second visit, when he lost this 7–8%, he lost about 5%, okay? We gave a biphosphonate, it was a gain of 8% in BMD after 2 years. But in the same period of time, the TBS was still decreasing by another 5%. So we have a gain in BMD and a decline in the structure of the bone, and that most likely led that patient to have these vertebral fractures. So we switch to a PTH and we give a Osteo at that time, and this the patient never had another vertebral fracture and regained both in BMD and TBS that were putting the patient on the safer side. So that's another time where we had like almost a normal BMD, but the decline of TBS was kind of a safety measure. They demonstrate that we have some like a safety issue. Well, not safety, but they, a fracture, the risk of fracture was still degraded because of the degradation of the TBS over time, while the BMD was going okay. So meaning, like for BMD, if we have an increase in BMD or an increase in TBS, we're happy. If we have a stable BMD or stable TBS, we are like, you know, it's fine because it's like a gain by absence of loss. But if we have a gain of BMD or decrease in TBS or decrease in BMD, then it starts to be worrisome. And then in any case, we're supposed to understand what's going on there. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? If you have some after the fact, we're more than happy to take them as well if you happen to come up with something that you didn't think about initially.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask any questions or type it in, or you can even ask if you want to unmute your because we're not we only like 12, 15 something 12 plus the 3, so you can just unmute and ask the question directly if you feel like it, or you can type in it, or as Shelley proposed, you can send someone the questions and then we answer by email one way or another. I have no problem with that.
Great.
So maybe I will make a comment myself on one statement you made, Shelley, and I need just to fine tune about what you say.
Okay.
In a sense that you said at one point that TBS is a gold standard in bone microstructure assessment. Yes and no.
In routine clinical practice.
Yeah, that makes the whole difference, because for me, the gold standard in microstructure will still be the micro CT or even bone biopsy, which is really the gold standard. So for that purpose, the TBS is not the gold standard because we need something more a study for that. However, in clinical routine, where we can assess an estimation of the structure within a few seconds, in that case, I would agree with you, but not as a global gold standard for bone microstructure. I think there is, will this run training for the technologies performing the exam? Okay, you should always, is no really additional training, so to speak. You just need to understand what can impact, meaning that's the garbage in, garbage out, as I mentioned. At the beginning anyway, the positioning of the patient is key, even for the BMD, okay? So it doesn't require the spatial positioning to have a good measurement of TBS. However, what will impact the TBS is, for example, if you, the BMI, if it's out of range, then could add too much noise in an image to have an accurate estimation of the TBS, okay? Actually like BMD, but even more than BMD. So what I mean here, if you enter the weight and height for the patient, then you have to be sure that you do that properly. Now, if you have a follow-up scan, you have to re-measure your patient and re-enter the new value of BMI, meaning the weight and height, because that the change of weight will impact both the BMD and also the TBS, so you have to be more accurate. But otherwise, everything is perfectly automatic, meaning that you do the scan, all the analyses that have been performed from the spine itself will be automatically transferred to the TBS analysis, so you don't need to redo anything else. So like what you did for the BMD will be applied by the TBS automatically, so you have no additional things to be performed. Now, again, like for BMD, you have to be careful about the edge detection, that over the time, the edge detection be the same, the labbing of the vertebrae, but that's exactly the same that for BMD. And once you have done that properly for the BMD, it's automatically performed properly for the TBS. Does it answer your question, Dorita?
To add to that, when we do have some e-learning modules that are very helpful. They talk a lot about the clinical aspect of it. They do a little bit of technical training so that people who have questions about TBS can learn it. And that's available to anybody. So if you guys have interest in having access to the e-learning, I'm more than happy to provide that to you or to your technologist.
So there is a third question, but that would be for you, Shelley, is we have the, from Sanchita, so we have a TBS 3.0, and how can we get the 3.1?
Okay, well, there's two answers to that. One of which is if you've purchased if you've got the 3.0 within the last year, you're actually eligible for a free upgrade, because if you purchase within a year, if the upgrade occurs, you get that. That's part of the warranty. If you've had it for longer than that, you can touch base with your Hologic rep, and they will be able to get you set up with the upgrade, with the 3.1. So your Hologic rep will be able to take care of all of that for you.
Okay. So this one is done. I try to do. This one is, so I guess it's done. And this one, I guess it's, I don't know if I do things right. Okay. Done and done. So you see my hand, because the camera is really at the keyboard level. Really is very weird to put the camera there anyway. Okay, so is any further questions? Don't be afraid. As I used to say, there is no stupid questions, only stupid answer. Okay. Don't be afraid about asking questions. I always say that to my students when I'm teaching at the hospital. Don't be afraid to ask any question, only stupid answer, no stupid questions. I think
there's one question.
One more. Will the TBS get generalized on all patients that need quality for this, or will only report to TBS per doctor order? I guess it depends of the country and the practice of your site. The way we did in Achieve, where we were lucky just to have the software at the very early days. So we've been testing the TBS for a while, and then we tested internally without sharing the result outside the site, because it was really the early days of TBS. And then after, we decided that he was bringing so much information that we'll share that with all partners. So what we did at the beginning, first of all, since we were one of the first to use the TBS, so we went on a local TV talking about the added value of TBS and so on. And because of that, our standard exploded, because every patient wanted to have TBS done in our site. So we just literally improve and increase the number of patients to our site. So that was quite interesting. Second, what we did is when we start using the TBS in our site, we start to use it systematically on all our patients, whether or not asked by the referring doctors. We start to using it, but then we had a letter, accompanying letter to a referring physician to explain what was the TBS, why we provided that to them, and giving like some explanation and so on. So yeah, we did that for several months, and then now every time a referring doctor just talk to us, just referring patients, because we act with our own patients, but we also provide DXA for external patients. So we have about 4,000 patients per year as a DXA, and about 3,500 consultations. So what it tells us is that at the end today, there is no doctors, referring doctors, they always ask BMD plus TBS plus VFA. So they systematically request for it.
And I know most of the centers that have TBS in the United States report it on almost all their patients. We recently had to do a survey with regards to that to help us with our reimbursement application. And they all basically said that they reported on all their patients just because of the added value is too much not to. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight of other centers.
Now, the other question is a reference curve based on the same edit-score as used for BMD T-score biologic? The answer is yes. So we had Jan Shepard, who were centralizing the NN's data and so on, and with the CDC and so on. So it took like almost 2 years just to get the reference curve, and they publish it, and then we had like an adjustment. But that's the NN's curve that is into the report. Now, if someone decides to switch and pick another reference curve, then we can still provide the BMD T-score adjusted by TBS, but then the reference curve that you will use will be maybe something different if you're from different country. But by definition, by default, we use the NN's curve. Okay?
Great.
So I think that answers that question.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end of the hour that we have, and I wanted to thank all of you, but if you have another question, please don't hesitate to ask. We still have a few minutes. But I did want to provide a little piece of information that we're just now being able to share with everybody that we recently were able to obtain. And so since you guys are our select few that have joined us on this call, I'd like to share it with you, that we actually just recently received CPT code for TBS. So that's some very exciting news. And now, of course, we go through the rest of the process for the reimbursement. So you'll be able to hear more about that in the not too distant future. So since
well, I guess I will answer the last question, but that for US, So there is, so for example, in Germany, there is some code that can be used. In some other country, it's ongoing. I'm not quite sure you can give the CPT code already.
Yeah, no, we won't actually have the code number until January, just by the way the process works. So unfortunately, I can't yet because I don't have it either. But a code has been approved.
So it's been approved like end of September, beginning of October. So just like a new hot news. But there is the whole process is still ongoing for the code, the amount, and different things and so on. So that's a whole process. Now, having said that, a lot of countries just a lot of patients paying out of pocket. And in some site, depending on where you are, if a hospital, I know it's a bit more complicated. If you're in private practice, a lot of sites in US or other parts in the world are just charging the patient out of pocket money, and the majority of the patient are paying it. So that means they have a brochure of flyers on the table, just describing, oh, can you do that, this and this and this, and it's been proposed to the patient, and most of the time, in 80% of the case, it's been accepted. Now the out-of-pocket money goes from €10 or $10 up to $150. I guess it depends where you live, and if you're living in Beverly Hills or some other site, or if you're living in the low country or whatever, the price can differ. So it's been a common practice in many countries around the world today. And the reimbursement be covered by Medicare.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for that information. Great.
All right. More than welcome, Nishita.
Yep.
Okay.
Good to hear from you. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. And Professor Hans, thank you so very much for that great information.
All right.
And for your time as well.
All
Thank
right.
you.